everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and editor here at Catholic Family News, and I'm glad to be joined by Phillip Campbell. Phillip has written some amazing articles, some historical articles for Catholic Family News, and is also an author of many books, but especially two we're going to be talking about: Heroes and Heretics, which covers the Protestant Revolt, and also In Pursuit of Wisdom is his latest work, Catholicism and Science Through the Ages. How have you been, Phillip?
I've been great. It's fantastic to be on the program, Murray.
Absolutely. Reading your articles and reading your books, it's obvious that you have this deep love of history and deep knowledge of history. I wanted, just to start off, what got you interested in history? And was there a specific time frame that you were interested in that made you delve deeper into this knowledge to want to be a teacher of history and a writer?
Yeah, well, I've always loved history ever since I was a kid. I can't remember a time when I wasn't looking at history books or something like that. Especially growing up in the '90s, when kind of culture was in a state of flux. Reading history really gave me a sense of grounding in the past and in Western culture and things like that. And I can't say it was any one particular time period, but I remember first reading a history book that talked about ancient Rome and the Republic and stuff, and I was pretty enamored by that. And as many people over the centuries have been enamored by Rome, and it kind of opened a door for me. And education wasn't my first calling. I tried to be an artist at first. I went to art college and everything, and then eventually that didn't pan out. And I thought, I'm going to try doing history for a living, and somehow I've made it work for the past 17 years. So thanks be to God.
Yeah, and it certainly has worked. And your books are very interesting in really their perspective. Of course, you're coming from a Catholic perspective, and I wanted to start off by talking about there's this narrative that you see in especially traditional Catholic thought about how really the crisis in the world, the crisis with liberalism, it goes back to the Protestant Revolt. And I think something really interesting in your work is you cover that it goes before that, really. There's a good chapter in your book, Exhausted Christendom, where you talk about some of the conflict between church and state and how that really led to the deterioration of
Yeah.
Christendom at the time. I wanted to ask you, what do you think allowed the Protestant revolt to be so successful at its time? Of course, there were heretical movements before the
Sure.
Protestant revolt, but what do you think in particular allowed the Protestant revolt to succeed and have the magnitude that it did?
I've thought a lot about this over the years, and I've come to the conclusion that really the church could hold itself together so long as it was the best organized entity in Christendom, the best organized and the most highly educated. But I think what really tips the balance is once the nation states in the 14 and 1500s start consolidating, and all of a sudden you get the secular governments attaining a level of organization and resources and education in their bureaucracies that are comparable to the church. All of a sudden now the secular governments have the weight to challenge the church, to stand up to it if and when some circumstance comes along where they would want to challenge the church. And I think you see the heterodox movements of the Reformation really intersect with the growing power of the nation states on the question of the nationalization of church property. If you really dig back into the economics of the era, during the 1500s, this is when warfare is starting to get extremely expensive. I mean, warfare is always expensive. It's the most expensive thing a country can do. But you're starting to get warfare over a bigger scale, like in the New World on the high seas, involving gunpowder and artillery and things like that. And it's getting vastly more expensive. And I think what happens is that you see amongst all the heterodox movements of the Reformation, one thing they all have in common is they argue for the nationalization of church property. They argue against like an international entity like the church that manages the property, and they want the individual nation states to control church property. And that just, gosh darn it, that is so convenient when you are a nation state that's cash strapped and you have an entity like the church that maybe has jurisdiction over, in some places, a third of the property in your kingdom. So you find that the motives of the nation state and the ideology of the reformers kind of intersect on this question of church property. And that's why, regardless of whether you're talking about Calvinists, Lutherans, Anabaptists, right, Covenanters in Scotland, the Reformation is always followed by the seizure of church property by the government. So I really think it's the rise of the nation state that really makes the difference here, because this sort of thing simply couldn't have happened, in the 11th century when the nation state didn't exist and there was so many broken feudal entities. So I think this is what makes it different. It's a common thread through all the Reformation sects, is that the church property should be nationalized.
And it's a difficult thing, isn't it? Because when we look at, especially within the past century, past 2 centuries, there's this fascination with nationalism. And of
Yep.
course, what we're talking about isn't the romantic nationalist movements that we saw later. But do you think that as Catholics, we should see the development of a unified nation state as just a negative turn in history, or is it more nuanced than that? Is it more complicated, where it's simply that view of the nation state, a view of nationalism, that puts it above the church?
I think the latter. If you read the like the writings, for example, of Pope Leo XIII, who was Pope from 1878 to 1903, I believe, right on the cusp of when a lot of these nationalism is emerging in Europe as a more potent force, you will see Leo making a distinction between kind of like what we would call a broad nationalism, like just nationalism as wanting the best for my country, kind of patriotism, loving my own, being like pro whatever, pro France, pro America, whatever, versus kind of like a more narrow nationalism that is atheistic or anti-clerical. And Leo makes a strong distinction between those things. He even encourages French people to embrace the Republic. I can't remember the year of that encyclical, but there's still a lot of discussion in the 1880s about should we try to fight for the monarchy. And Leo says, just embrace the Republic, but try to align it along principles that are synonymous with the Catholic Church's view of the world. Now, you really have to distinguish, too, between like an idea itself versus how it tends to unfold in real time. And nationalism definitely unfolded, at least in the 1800s, as hostile to the church, but it doesn't need to be that way. It didn't have to be that way. It's more, especially in places like Italy, where nationalists saw the church as a hindrance to national unity. They looked at something like the Papal States and said the existence of the church and the Papal States is the one thing standing in the way of Italian greatness. And in other places, you didn't have that. You certainly had these beautiful 2 centuries of the French ascendancy, from the close of the religious wars up until the French Revolution. The 1600s, the age of the Sun King, is like the glorious apogee of French culture in the early modern period. And that's a very nationalistic period in French history. So I think it is very nuanced. It depends on whether it depends on whether nationalism is viewing the church as a master that needs to be dethroned versus kind of like a cultural force that can be integrated into a nationalist vision. And this is why I think we always need to be careful about nationalism, because it can go off the rails. It can become an idol. And we've seen that in many places, throughout history. But it also, like many other social forces and ideologies, it can be baptized and turned towards wholesome ends.
Mm-hmm. Looking back on some of these mass societal movements, I almost get the sense that the church has been one step behind when it comes to reacting to these things, and that's caused a lot of these crises to escalate. I wanted to ask you, do you think, in when we look at especially the Protestant revolt, do you think that the church could have done something? And of course, we're playing, backseat driver in a
Yeah,
way, but do you
yeah.
think that there's something that the church could have done in reacting quicker, in a more swift way, in a more understanding way of the circumstance involved, that would have allowed this to not happen, allowed all of those people to remain inside of Christendom?
Yes and no. I mean, we have to acknowledge that, like, oftentimes the chain of events that set off a historical epoch are just kind of like incidental. They're kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. Like, even if Johann Tetzel hadn't have made Luther angry, and even if Luther hadn't have posted the 95 Theses when he did, it's likely that something like that would have happened by someone else in some other place. So, without getting too focused on the small things that, or the particulars, I think you can answer yes if you go back further and get a broader picture of things. There's lots of causes for the Reformation. Some of them are proximate, some of them are remote. I tend to think that the Western Schism and conciliarism were very devastating for the church. They damaged the church's credibility. And during the Western Schism in particular, the church yielded a lot of its authority to the secular powers because, of course, during the Western Schism, you have two men claiming to be pope, and then later you have a third one after the Council of Pisa. And where are those popes going to get support? Because they have enemies within the church, right? Every pope has his own rival papal court. They're looking for support from who? From the secular kings. They're going. The Avignon popes are looking to be benefited by the kings of France, or the Roman popes by various kingdoms, and they're promising different things. They're giving the secular powers leverage in exchange for their support in the Western Schism, and that just simply kind of yields back a lot of the leverage that the church before the schism had. Conciliarism, of course, is it's a heresy that starts around the 1400s and isn't really put down until 2 years before Martin Luther posts the 95 Theses with the Fifth Lateran Council. And that is just a century of challenging the authority of the Pope and whether or not he really does possess the jurisdiction that he claims. So all of these things going on, they kind of create conditions conducive for this sort of thing. But at the same time, they also delay reform. They delay the church's ability to reform itself. There's some great reform movements going on in the church at the time of the Reformation. I talk about it in my book, especially in Spain and in England as well. England had if Henry VIII never came along, the English church would have had a totally different trajectory. It would have been it would have been the most educated of all the churches in Christendom in the 1500s. But because of all the turmoil going on, you find that the church was not able to reform itself in the 14th century to the degree that it could. And the reason this was, or I'm sorry, the 15th century. And the reason this was so important is because of that particular moment in history, the incredible rise in literacy on the part of the laity that came in the wake of the invention of the printing press. People often complain about the uneducated clergy in the age before the Reformation. It wasn't that the clergy were uneducated. It's that the education of the laity rose so quickly that the clergy did not keep up with it necessarily in terms of the education your average parish priest would have had. Obviously, we can point to the university professors, the theologians, but we have to realize those aren't the norm. Those aren't the people that you interacted with on a daily basis if you were just a Catholic living in Germany, right? You're interacting with parish priests. And their level of education did not keep up with the education that the laity were able to have access to with the printing press. And it's almost analogous, Murray, to what we have today, where you can look at your average, let's say your average kind of mid-grade Novus Ordo parish, right? With just kind of Father Boomer doing his thing. And many of the laity in his congregation, because of access to the internet and their own level of education, might have a better grasp on Catholic doctrine than that priest does, right? So you had something analogous in the decades leading up to the Reformation, and I think that had the church had something like had the Western Schism not been happening, they might have been able to focus on a whole century of reforming the education and morals of the clergy, not because it was so terrible, but just to update it in light of the printing press and bring it up even further. And you do see the church doing this eventually after the Council of Trent, right? When we get the seminary system and just the uniformity of studies that priests have to go through. And then once again, after Trent, clergy become very highly educated relative to the laity. But that honestly should have happened 150 years earlier if it could have happened. And it would have, I'm not saying it would have prevented the Reformation, but it would have like taken a very big club out of the hands of the reformers in terms of like, oh, the church is keeping you from reading the Bible, and the church is keeping you in darkness of doctrine and this sort of thing. So, I mean, that's one way to look at it. There's probably many other ways we could tease it out, but I think that's a very big one.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I think that gives some greater context too. We see a lot of people be very skeptical nowadays towards things like the manualist tradition. But like you said, the education of priests is extremely important. And I think that gives some more context to that. If we looked beyond the Reformation, nowadays we have this, it's
Yep.
very popular, the Whig narrative of history. Things
Oh
are
yeah.
always getting better and better and better. And you see this with, we'll talk about some more with science, which we'll talk about with your book. And the narrative is, of course, saying, well, we're going further and further away from this darkness of the authority of the Catholic Church, coming
Yeah.
out into this bright and sunshine of science. And I wanted to ask, an average person is going to look at history and say there was significant scientific development after the so-called Enlightenment, after the
Yep.
Protestant Revolt. What do you think allowed those kind of societies to have such great scientific development? And I think just from your average person, they might ask the question, why didn't we see that development when it was just a united Christendom under the Catholic Church?
Well, to some degree, you did. It's just that the development under Christendom wasn't as spectacular. It was more humble. It was like laying the foundation of the house. It's not exciting when you're just standing there watching the bulldozer dig a hole and lay a footing. It doesn't get exciting till the building goes up, but the foundation is very, very important. And the way that knowledge progresses in general, knowledge progresses cumulatively on a growth curve. It kind of goes like this in an exponential way. So you might ask, why does science progress faster, in the 16 and 1700s than it did in the Middle Ages? But then I can step back and say, why did science progress faster in the Middle Ages than it did in the Greco-Roman period? And why did the Greco-Romans progress faster than the Egyptians? And why did they progress faster than Paleolithic people? It's because knowledge accumulates in an incremental way. Every little step that humanity claws forward, it throws another stone in the pile and makes it a little bit bigger and enables us to see a little bit further. And as that pile gets larger, our vistas get larger, and then it starts growing exponentially. It's almost like a compound interest of knowledge, right? So for example, the advancements in physics of the Enlightenment and ballistics and things that made the European conquest of the world possible couldn't have happened without the mathematical advances of the mathematical school of the Merton calculators in 14th century Oxford, right? These advances were all built on earlier advances that made them possible. You get the first mechanical clocks, as early as the 10th century. And that's the beginning of the escarpment mechanism, which is going to be similar to the mechanism that they're going to use later to invent the device that allows ships to keep accurate measurements on sea, that allows them to discover how to measure longitude accurately. That makes huge advances in the 18th century. So there's all these things just build on one another, right? And something you see in the Middle Ages is that because it's happening under Christendom, a lot of the inventions are anonymous. A lot of the steps forward are anonymous because they're made by monks, right? Because a monk isn't a celebrity. A monk isn't a scientist that says, "Hey, everybody, look at my invention. Read my paper," right? A monk is a humble person trying to sanctify his soul. And when that monk invents something like the eyeglasses or the mechanical clock or something like that, they're not getting a lot of worldly recognition for it. In fact, in my book, In Pursuit of Wisdom, I have an interesting quote where even I think it was only 20 years after the eyeglasses were invented and nobody knew who invented them. They just were invented by some monastic and his identity had already been forgotten. I think in the modern day, we are very used to a kind of almost like a celebrity approach to scientific advancement where we associate specific advances with specific people that we can pinpoint, like, oh yeah, Galileo invented the telescope, Newton discovered this, Einstein did this, right? These specific people made these specific contributions. But that's not how science advanced in the Middle Ages. It was largely the work of anonymous monastics. So I just think that whole framework is false. And I cover this thoroughly in my book, In Pursuit of Wisdom. There was constant scientific development throughout the Middle Ages in all facets of science, in practical science like mechanics, in metallurgy, in chemistry. It was continuous. It just wasn't as glamorous as we see it today. But it was those foundations that made possible the advancements of the Enlightenment and beyond.
Yeah, and I want to delve in deeper into your book, In Pursuit of Wisdom. Before we do, I wanted to get this is there's a lot of controversy surrounding a lot of these issues today: evolution,
Yeah.
geocentrism. All of these things are very controversial. What inspired you to write this book? Going back, looking at the history, looking at the Catholic development of science, examining some of these more modern controversies. What was the primary thing motivating you to write this?
Well, I've always been very interested in the subject. In fact, the first article I ever had published in my career was on Catholic scientists, where it was on St. Austin Review back in like 2007. I did an article on Catholic clerical scientists. I've always been fascinated by the church's tradition of the cleric as a man of science, which you see throughout like the Reformation, Renaissance, and early modern period, where science wasn't just something that the church supported, but science was considered a clerical occupation almost exclusively. But more recently, I got interested in this because I was reading research from you might have heard of the CARA, CARA, the Center for Apply. Oh, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's this institute that pulls together surveys from Catholics about what they believe, their practice of faith, etc. And the CARA organization had done some studies on why young Catholics leave the church. And dominant among the reasons why Catholics leave the church was because of perceived contradictions between faith and science. And I got lots of quotes from the study in my book. And it really doesn't matter that, Bishop Barron is out there saying, hey, there's no contradiction, or that John Paul II was saying, hey, they don't. Basically, the youth, for whatever reason, they're not buying it or they don't understand it. And they continue to leave the church in droves because of perceived incongruities between a scientific worldview and a religious worldview. And so I wanted to dig very deeply into the subject. I didn't want to settle for platitudes. There's a well-known interview, maybe you're familiar with it, several years ago when the late Cardinal Pell was still alive. He debated Richard Dawkins, and the moderator asked Cardinal Pell if he believed in a literal Adam and Eve, right? And Cardinal Pell kind of hemmed and hawed and said, no, it's a mythic, interpretation. And then Dawkins jumped right in and said, if it's mythic, then how do you account for original sin in your theology? Because that's, supposed to be passed down from an actual sin committed by an actual, and Cardinal Pell had no answer for it. And the host kind of moved on to the next question. And to me, and nothing against Cardinal Pell, the guy went through a lot, but I found
Right.
the answer very inadequate. And for me, it symbolized kind of like the modern church's attempt to just paper over the difficulty with platitudes by just saying, oh, like we can just figure all this stuff. We can just harmonize it. There's no contradiction. And Dawkins had the better of that exchange because he pointed out, no, if you say X, then it has Y implications for this theology. And when I got to writing this book, I wanted to dig down into the mud, of these various debates and see what people were saying on these different sides, and try to kind of go through the mud and come out and say, no, see, there is no, like, I'm not just going to say there's no contradiction. I'm going to show you why there's no contradiction, and really not be afraid to dig into these difficult questions. So that was my impetus with writing the book.
Yeah, and I do think there is a lack of seriousness in the mainstream Catholic Church when dealing with the issues. I think you're right on there. I think people notice that just because Word on Fire or someone else comes out saying there is no contradiction, it takes more than that. And of course, one of the main issues people will bring up, it seems to just be ingrained in everybody, is the Galileo question. Now, reading your book and hearing much of the modern discourse on that, it would seem the church had a favorable attitude towards Copernicus, but of course, Galileo is more complicated. And I wanted to
Yeah.
get your overview of the situation, how you view the Galileo controversy.
We'll just kind of sum up Galileo. So you're right. The church didn't seem to have a problem with Copernicus. Copernicus's earliest critics were other scientists. The Copernican theory was blasted shortly after its publication, not for its religious implications, but because it was considered scientifically implausible. And there's various reasons for that I don't want to get bogged down in. But for example,
Right, yeah.
One argument was that if the planets were rotating the sun, you should be able to see phases on Venus like you see on the moon, but no phases of Venus were visible. And Copernicus had no answer for this other than that, well, maybe Venus is unique and it's made of a transparent material that light passes through, or something like that. So Copernicanism was an outlier in the scientific community for 75 years after it was. I mean, people kind of knew it was out there. It was an interesting theory, but most people were looking for answers still within the Ptolemaic framework. Now, I should mention, though, at this time, the Ptolemaic system was by this time known to be inadequate because of the advances in mathematics and astronomy that happened through the Middle Ages. All serious astronomers understood that Ptolemy's system, as handed down from ancient times, was no longer adequate. The question was not whether we were going to keep Ptolemy or jettison Ptolemy. It was rather whether we were going to jettison Ptolemy or find a new system that still operated within a general Ptolemaic framework, but wasn't the same as Ptolemy. So Copernicus wasn't the only one putting out alternate systems. But what happened going into the beginning of the 17th century was there were some astronomical phenomena that suddenly brought Copernicanism back into the mainstream, which was two supernovas, the Cassiopeia supernova, and which is also known as Tycho's supernova. And then there was another one. But the issue was that it wasn't so much, it wasn't so much about the Bible or theology. It was about Aristotelianism, because the conception of the heavens at this time was heavily influenced by Aristotle. And contrary to what many people think, the height of Aristotle's influence was not in the 13th century in the age of Aquinas. It was actually in the humanist period in the Renaissance. You see, obviously, in Aquinas, sorry, I got to go down this rabbit hole here. In the time of Aquinas, you see Aquinas and the scholastics drawing heavily on Aristotle, but you also see them parsing him, right? You see them taking things they like and not taking things that they don't agree with. You see commentaries on Aristotle saying he's right here, but we can improve on it here, right? It's a more measured approach to Aristotle that allows a true synthesis. When you get to the humanist era in the 1400s and the 1500s, they are focusing so much emphasis on the ancient authors, the Greek and Roman authors. They almost deify them to a point where now Aristotle can't be wrong. Galen can't be wrong. They almost have kind of an infallibility about them. I'm using that word loosely, where it was scandalous in Galileo's age to suggest that Aristotle's view of the heavens was wrong. And what happens is these supernovas challenge Aristotle's view, because nothing was supposed to be mutable in the heavens, right? The planets, everything in the heavens was supposed to be made of an immutable quintessence that didn't suffer decay, that was eternal, that was in perfect spheres and perfect movements. But then you had these supernovas appear, and supernova in Latin means new. It's literally a new star. That shouldn't be possible in the Aristotelian schema. So the question was, where is this star located? It had to be in the atmosphere, according to Aristotle, because it's only in the atmosphere that you can have mutable things. That wasn't being borne out by the evidence, though. Like, for example, the Jesuit father Christopher Clavius was one of the greatest scientists of the age. He did measurements of the supernova from all different points, and based on something called the parallax, which is like the apparent position of something relative to its distance, he determined that this supernova must be incredibly far away, farther than Venus, farther than the moon, i.e., it's in the heavens, where, according to Aristotle, it shouldn't be. So the appearance of these supernovas led people to drag out Copernicus and question whether this was a more viable explanation. Now, that in itself wasn't a big deal. You had, and I go through it in my book, there was several clergymen, scientists who were proposing a Copernican view. Galileo, what makes him different is his invention of the telescope catapults him to celebrity. Not invention of the telescope, but invention of the first telescope that can see detailed things. Galileo points out that there's spots on the sun. The surface of the moon is bumpy. There's ears on Saturn, which is what he called Saturn's rings. He said Saturn had ears, which is cute. But most notably, through his telescope, he could see that Venus did in fact have phases, just like people said it should. So these discoveries catapulted Galileo to celebrity status. And he proposed Copernicanism as the answer to these things. Now, the church, of course, was the custodian of science in these days. Like, what people will ask, why did the church care about this? It's not just because of the theology, it's because of the science. So, for example, when Robert Bellarmine wrote a letter to Father Christopher Clavius asking about Galileo, his letter is about the scientific merits of Copernicanism. Robert Bellarmine wants to know things like, is the telescope reliable? Could there be something in the lenses that are making us see these things wrong? Is Galileo collecting his data in a scientifically sound manner? He's asking very empirical questions because the church did judge the scientific merit of different theories because, as I said, science was a clerical vocation, right? I mean, who else was doing science in the Middle Ages? It wasn't like the sloppy, illiterate peasants,
Right.
Like science was the domain of the church. Now, where Galileo gets into trouble is he doesn't just propound this theory, but he starts trying to offer a new hermeneutic for how to interpret the Bible. He writes a letter to Duchess Christina and proposes this whole new hermeneutic for how to interpret biblical passages. And he insists that it be adopted uncritically, and he mocks those who hesitate to embrace it. And at this point, he kind of strays from being a scientist into being a theologian and a philosopher, and he starts to get on the radar of the church. Now, the Pope at the time, Urban VIII, is a supporter of Galileo. He actually tells Galileo, he has 6 audiences with the Pope. That tells you how much the Pope was impressed by him. And he spent a lot of time with him. He told Galileo, look, I like your ideas. I think there's merit to them, but we have to be careful in asserting this as absolute truth. And he says, it's best to just realize we can't really know how God ordered things up in the heavens. There's multiple explanations that can make sense of this. There's multiple mathematical models that will work. And we have to be careful arguing this as absolute truth until we, unless some time comes along where we have more demonstrable verification. And then Galileo goes and he writes a book called The Dialogue of the World Systems. And he takes the Pope's argument that Urban made and puts it in the mouth of a character in the book called Simplicio, which in Italian means like the simpleton or the fool. And he just makes the Pope look stupid. It's clearly supposed to be a caricature of the Pope. And Urban is highly offended. Galileo's books actually were not condemned by the Holy Office, the Index of the Congregation. They actually saw his books and they made moderate corrections, like they changed words like assert to assume to show like you're just assuming this. But Urban personally insisted that Galileo be tried by the Inquisition. And long and short, I go through the whole trial in the book. He was sentenced of being suspected of heresy for pushing the absurd and philosophically ridiculous theory of Copernicanism. The Inquisition came down hard on him. Galileo had made lots of enemies. He was arrogant and bombastic, and if he was alive today, we'd call him a troll. He'd be called a troll probably, because he was good at trolling his opponents. Mm-hmm. So he received a sentence, but the sentence was immediately commuted to just reciting the penitential psalms 7 times a week, and he was sent home. As I view this was a case of like when a father sees his son doing something bad and he calls the police to scare the boy, like, they're going to take you off to jail now, son, but like doesn't really intend on imprisoning him, because he gets condemned. But then as soon as he's condemned, his punishment is mitigated to just saying the Psalms. And Copernicanism remains condemned, but it's never enforced. Like immediately after the Galileo case, you still see Copernican writings proliferating throughout the 1600s. Nobody else was ever called before the Inquisition for it. And the church's judgment against Galileo was dropped or overturned, depending on how you interpret it, in I think 1757. So that's the ins and outs of the Galileo trial.
And something very interesting in what you said is talking about Aristotelianism and its influence on the Catholic Church and in just Western thinking in general. And something I found very striking in your latest book was the West has been wrestling with this question of being for a long time.
Yeah.
And Heraclitus this goes back all the way to Aristotle commenting on Heraclitus, who said that everything is in the state of flux. Everything is constantly changing. And Aristotle, of course, says there's a being that underlies reality. And I wanted to give a quote from your book and ask you to commentate on this. You said, you talked about evolution, and you say, if evolution is true, then is there really any underlying being that undergoes accidental change but is not itself changed? If all things are constantly developing, then being is becoming. Everything is in the state of flux. And then you ask the question, could the concept of substance be in such an evolution, have any meaning in such an evolutionary model? What I wanted to ask you, a fairly broad question again, is, do you think that the Catholics, especially in this modern day, what we see in your average Novus Ordo community, do you think they've succeeded in reconciling evolution with an Aristotelian framework that doesn't compromise the Catholic and traditional Thomistic philosophical and theological approach?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I don't know that most run-of-the-mill Catholics in your average Novus Ordo parish have an Aristotelian framework to even contradict.
Fair enough.
So have they reconciled it? No, but probably because they don't have an Aristotelian framework to begin with. I think this issue of substance is the real issue here. I personally don't think the real issue is whether God could orchestrate reality, that one thing changes into another thing over time. I think the real issue is their underlying being, because the Catholic Church absolutely has adopted and embraced the notions of substance, right? That there is an underlying, there's human nature. I mean, that's what nature is as a substance, right? When we're talking about human nature, we're talking about the substance of being a human person. Without the concept of substance, there is no Catholic theology. There is no Catholic morality. And so I think this is the fundamental issue here. And I'm kind of surprised that when I was reading the source material on the debates about evolution in the post-Darwinian era, this didn't come up really. There was a lot of wrangling about very particular things like, okay, well, maybe Adam's body could have been created by pre-existing matter, but what about Eve? Because she came from Adam's rib. So how do you read that? Like very, very particular questions about the biblical narrative. But I was surprised that in the records of the debates of the Congregation of the Index on various evolutionary books, that I didn't come across debates about substance. Maybe they were in there, and that the secondary sources I was reading just didn't quote them. But at any rate, I think that most Catholics have embraced evolution, but I don't think they've embraced it in an integrated way. That is, if you were to ask them, how do you reconcile that with, say, original sin having to come from two original parents, right? I don't think they would have a ready answer for how to reconcile that. I think that probably practically speaking, most, and I'm just saying Novus Ordo, kind of normie Catholics, I think they're operating under a practical version of C.J.R. Brabant's two truth theory, where they've accepted a scientific truth and then there's a religious truth, and they simultaneously hold both without attempting to reconcile them. So that's where I think most people are at. Now, that's a different question from saying, do I believe it can be reconciled? I think it probably could. And I talk about it in the book a little bit. And I don't put my own ideas into this book. When I say that it could, I'm giving other authors and other authorities' opinions on how it could be reconciled. You could have, for example, some have proposed, you could have substances that God created, but there's a certain elasticity within that substance where it's not possible for anything to transform into anything, but it is possible, for, say, something that has four legs to develop into another version of that thing with four legs, a deer into a giraffe or whatever, a more moderated form of evolution. But one thing I stress in the book, and this is important, is that Darwinism is not the same as evolution. One thing I did notice in the 19th century is that Catholic theologians made a distinction between transformism and Darwinism. And transformism was just the basic concept that things could change over time, regardless of the mechanism of how they changed. Darwinism in specific was the idea of evolution by means of a mechanistic natural selection. And this was universally condemned. I did not find any Catholic authorities that embraced Darwinism hook, line, and sinker. Basically, the approach of the church in the late 19th century, early 20th centuries, you found people all over the map on it. You found people that rejected the thing whole scale and were skeptical of it. And you found a lot of people who supported transformism, but they were troubled by the materialist philosophy of Darwin. And what they tried to do was find some sort of harmonization or reconciliation where they could keep transformism, but kind of shorn of its materialist philosophy. And most of the critiques of Darwinism were about its materialist presuppositions. And so they were struggling to find a way to shave that off of it. And you found some people saying, yes, we can do this, and other people saying, no, Darwinism and materialism are so wedded together that you can't have transformism without a materialist framework for it. And I'm just going to go into this, like the way the church approached this. There was 6 cases of books being brought to the Congregation of the Index between, I think, 1878 and 1900 that had to do with evolution. And what I found from studying this is that both, so you find, this is why history is so interesting. It'll upturn what you thought. I'd been used to a certain dichotomy in the debate, this dichotomy of trads saying the church has always condemned evolution. And then kind of like more modern normies saying the church has never had a problem with evolution. And I found out that both of those positions were wrong. They were wrong in the sense of this. The church has definitely had problems with evolution. It's impossible to read the debates that were going on in the Congregation of the Index about some of this literature and come to the conclusion that theologians were just happy with evolution. They absolutely had grave reservations about it for all the reasons you can imagine they would have reservations about it. But it's also false to say that the church has condemned evolution. No book proposing evolution was ever condemned by the Holy Office. You had 3 books that were condemned by the Congregation of the Index, which is different, and it's not authoritative. And of those 3 books that were condemned, it's questionable whether they were condemned because of evolution, because the Index the Congregation of the Index did not divulge publicly why they condemn books. So, for example, you got a book by the English Catholic writer Saint George Mivart. Saint George is his first name. He's not a saint. He died excommunicate, but his name is Saint George. Okay. You have a book where he argues for evolution, and you also have writings of him where he's arguing that people can be happy in hell. And he gets condemned because of his teaching that people can be happy in hell, but he also argues for evolution. But these things aren't spelled out in the condemnations of the Index. So you don't have any cases where a book was condemned specifically and explicitly for evolution. You do see the Congregation of the Index going outside official channels with certain books. For example, Father Dalmas Leroy, a French Dominican who wrote a book favorable to evolution, you find the congregation going to him through back channels and saying, we don't like your book and we'd prefer that you withdrew it from circulation. And if you don't, it might get condemned. And Father Leroy saying, I don't want to risk that. So he withdraws his book. But that's not the same as a formal condemnation. So what you find is that essentially is that the church discouraged the spread of evolution, but evolutionary thought, but through unofficial means. And by unofficial means, I mean things like peer pressure, using behind-the-scenes wrangling, implied threats, quid pro quo arrangements with specific authors. Basically, the church understood that evolution often went hand in hand with atheism and materialism, and they understood that logically transformism was distinct from atheism, but it was so often being used as a club in the hands of the church's enemies that they were just wary of allowing it to spread unchecked. And so they did everything they could to check the spread of evolutionary thought, but specifically without condemning it outright. And I think because they were afraid of coming out on the wrong side if the science should prove them wrong. And the Galileo case was absolutely in everybody's mind here. The one time that any pope ever intervened in one of these cases was when Pope Leo XIII intervened to stop, and I stress to stop, Father John Zahm's book on evolution from getting condemned. Father John Zahm was an American priest who wrote a book called Evolution and Dogma. It was about to get condemned by the Index, and Pope Leo XIII intervened to stop its public condemnation and to allow Father Zahm to kind of handle the situation privately. And what Father Zahm did was he privately went to the publishers and had the book withdrawn from circulation. So this is why I say it's not true to say the church condemned evolution. And it's also not true to say the church accepted it. I will say the accurate view is that the church didn't like it and did everything it could to stop it from spreading, short of publicly condemning it.
Yeah. And I think that's really interesting, especially because nowadays we think of it almost as an issue that's only been going on for the past 60, 70 years. But as you said, it's been going on for quite a long time. Yeah. Philip, to wrap things up, yep, I think there's a lot of people in today's world who are sort of fearful and scared because everything going on around them seems so unprecedented. And I wanted to get your take on something we've been talking about on the show recently, which in past episodes, is history cyclical? Can we call it that in a simple way? Can we call it cyclical? Of course, there's communities adjacent to the traditional Catholic movement that might promote somebody like Spangler, who writes about cyclical history. Thomas Carlyle seems to promote this as well. When you're reading history in the past, do you think we can say that it operates in a cyclical cycle to the point where we can draw fruit today, knowing that it is running in a sort of cycle, or is that not nuanced enough and we need a different approach?
Well, if you followed my writing or heard me speak enough, you'll know that I'm going to say it's not nuanced enough. I do think that history has certain rules that let's say common threads, like ruts that it follows. I wouldn't say it's cyclical. I would say it's more like a helix that kind of goes like this, where you'll find iterations of something. You
Mm,
know, like the Russian Revolution resembles the French Revolution, right? And revolutions follow a certain pattern, but they're not all the same, you know. There's variations, and to the degree that it's cyclical, it's because human nature remains the same, and we tend to, in kind of like mass psychology, respond in similar ways, but we have different circumstances that we're in, and it's hard to predict how things are going to unfold. I think history ultimately is on a linear path. I mean, ultimately, it has to be. It starts from a fixed point, creation, and it goes to the last judgment. That's like on
mm,
a line, you know. But I think as it moves up the line, it kind of goes like this, where there's not a repetition or a cyclical thing, but it's kind of like you get these senses like I've been here before, like troughs and peaks, rise and fall, you know. But it's going to look different in every instantiation, you know. So I think we can take wisdom from what's happened before us and even take consolation. If we're in a period that's down and out now, there's going to be a period of resurgence later under some other conditions, right? But I think we also have to be careful. And I mentioned this in one of my articles on my blog, Unam Sanctam Catholicam, called The Church's Historical Blind Spot, where Catholics have this tendency to excessively interpret current events through the past only. We see a
mm.
crisis and we go, oh, this is just like the Arian crisis, or oh, this is just like when this happened, and this is how it played out then, so this is what we can expect now, right? We had this heresy, and then we had this great pope that came along and he fixed it. And we tend to interpret what's happening now by leaning too heavily on what happened before. And obviously, I'm a history guy. I think we should be aware of what happened before. We should take consolation from it. But like you said earlier with the Protestant Reformation, and by the way, I think it's a myth that the church was too slow to respond to the Protestant Reformation. I go through that in my book, Heroes and Heretics. But the point is, uh, when the Protestant Reformation happened, the church did at the beginning think, oh, this is just kind of like more conciliarism, you know. And
Yep.
it took like a decade for the church to realize this was a new creature entirely. Or when the Albigensian heresy happened, the church said, oh, this is just Manichaeism again. So I think we have too much of a tendency to just say, oh, this is just whatever happening again. The Lord, you know, does bring new things into history, and we don't always know how it's going to unfold. So let's just keep a balance. Let's learn from the past, be educated about it, you know, kind of take it into consideration, but be aware that it's not just kind of like a myth of eternal recurrence that's happening.
Mhm. Well, Philip, this has been an amazing interview. There's a lot been covered. I'm sure I'm myself, and I'm sure our audience watching is going to be going to watch multiple times to get as much fruit from it. If people want to see more of your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, if you want to follow me on my blogging adventures, Unam Sanctam Catholicam, the blog and the website. There's two of them. There's Unam Sanctam Catholicam.blogspot, which is more contemporary stuff, and then there's unamsanctamcatholicam.com, which is more history essays. I've got a lot of books out there from various publishers, so you can just look me up on Amazon and find a lot of that stuff there, and on the pages of Catholic Family News.
Absolutely. And Philip has an amazing article this month that's coming out here in a few days. So be sure to check that out. So for all of our listeners, all of our viewers, thanks so much for watching. And Philip, thanks for joining.
Thank you, sir.